whoever you are, wherever you are, I'll see you all again.
The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has been taken out of the intensive care unit and is said to be well on his way to a full recovery. This is the story of how 3 months that should have been a series of Brexit victories for Boris Johnson instead are now characterised by indecision and dubious herd immunity plans that ultimately nearly led to the first death of a sitting British Prime Minister in 154 years.
Boris Johnson has promised to repay the trust of voters after leading the Conservatives to an extraordinary election victory.
We start the year January 1st on the island of Mystique, where Boris Johnson is on holiday after a crushing victory in last year's general election. It's January 26th, and Public Health England has moved its coronavirus risk level from very low to low. 3 days later, January 29th, and the first COVID-19 patient, a Chinese national, is rushed to hospital in the United Kingdom.
On Friday, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Medical Officer announced that 2 patients in England who are members of the same family tested positive for coronavirus. Public Health England is now contacting people who had close contact with these 2 confirmed cases.
January 31st, the UK leaves the European Union. Boris Johnson, it would appear, has succeeded in his main political project.
This is the moment when the dawn breaks and the curtain goes up on a new act in our great national drama.
This would have been the moment that defined his premiership, were it not for the oncoming coronavirus pandemic. February 26th, Boris Johnson makes his first public appearance for 12 days at PMQs. He's been on a working break at Grace and Favour Home Chevening over the parliamentary recess. At this stage, the government's plan for dealing with a lethal pandemic was herd immunity, but it would soon be abandoned. 2 days later, the first Briton dies after contracting COVID-19. They were a tourist on board the Diamond Princess cruise ship. It is the end of the worst week for global stock markets since the 2008 financial crash. March 3rd, Boris Johnson lays out the UK's coronavirus battle plan at a Downing Street press conference, where he says,
I can tell you that I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
The UK sees its first person die of the disease. March 10th, the first MP tests positive for the virus, Conservative MP Nadine Dorries. The World Health Organisation officially declares a pandemic. March 12th, Boris warns that
many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time.
As the UK moves from the containment stage to delay, he calls it
the worst public health crisis for a generation.
March 16th, and the beginning of a new week, Boris Johnson begins giving daily press conferences. The Cheltenham Festival starts, and over 250,000 people visit it over the 4 days. As the evidence mounts that the NHS will be overwhelmed, the government's behavioural nudge units are realised to be useful idiots, and the strategy U-turns. Isolation and suppression, tactics previously described as unscientific, are taken up last minute. Billions of pounds of financial support are announced. For the first time in British history, the state will pay its citizens' wages. March 18th, the government announces it is closing schools indefinitely. That Friday, the 20th, after being criticised for delaying a full lockdown, Boris Johnson orders restaurants and pubs to close.
We've been asking people to stay at home during this pandemic. And though huge numbers are complying, and I thank you all, the time has now come for us all to do more. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
March 26th, the Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer join in the NHS clap-along outside Downing Street. The next day, Boris Johnson says,
I've developed mild symptoms of the coronavirus, that's to say, a temperature and a persistent cough, and on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, I've taken a test that has come out positive.
The assumptions the country built its plan to fight the virus on are collapsing. There's a dual misunderstanding of the situation. The Prime Minister has been making the wrong decisions to fight coronavirus, and, by failing to follow his own advice, has contracted the disease himself. Johnson stands alone in Downing Street during the NHS clap-along. His smile looks more like a grimace. The next day, an unkempt Prime Minister gives another update on his condition.
In my own case, although I'm feeling better and I've done my 7 days of isolation, alas, I still have one of the symptoms, a minor symptom of I still have temperature.
The first weekend of April is momentous. It begins on April 4th with Sir Keir Starmer being elected leader of the Labour Party, as Jeremy Corbyn stands down. Then on the Sunday the 5th, the Queen makes a speech to the nation. It is only the 4th time she has done so, ever. She closes off with the powerful words, "We will meet again," an echo of the Virulin anthem during World War II.
We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when.
Later that evening, Boris Johnson is admitted to hospital.
This was a precautionary step because he continues to have persistent coronavirus symptoms 10 days after first having tested positive for the virus.
April 6th, Boris Johnson is moved into the ICU at St Thomas's Hospital and receives oxygen support. The UK was given forewarning about the severity of this pandemic, not just for its health service and workers, but the entire population. People like Boris Johnson. This chain of bad decisions, at best, has lost the Prime Minister 2 weeks of leadership at a time of national crisis, and at worst, could have cost him his life.